They laughed when the old veteran limped forward to claim his inheritance, a rusted metal toolbox that hadn't been opened in 30 years. But 3 weeks later, his aging yellow Labrador named Copper refused to leave that toolbox alone. What the dog found hidden beneath a false bottom would change everything. When Roy Hadley stood at the back of his uncle's funeral reception, no one paid him much attention. That was nothing new. He had spent most of his adult life being the person people didn't quite know what to do with. Too quiet at family dinners, too distant at holidays. A man who came home from 2 tours in Vietnam and never quite found his way back to who he had been before. He was 63 now, broad-shouldered but slower than he used to be, with a knee that ached in cold weather and a hearing aid he sometimes forgot to wear. He lived alone in a small house outside Meridian, Mississippi, on a gravel road that flooded every spring and dried to cracked clay every August. His neighbors were mostly farmers. His closest friend, if you could call it that, was a 12-year-old yellow Labrador named Copper, who walked, with a slight limp himself, the result of a fall off the back porch 2 winters ago. Roy had driven 4 hours to attend his uncle's funeral. Edgar Hadley had been the only person in the family who never treated Roy like a problem to be managed. Edgar had served in Korea, never talked about it much, but he understood certain silences. He used to call Roy every few weeks, never for any particular reason, just to talk about the weather, the price of feed corn, whether the bass were biting out on Lake Lowndes. Roy had always looked forward to those calls, and now there would be no more of them. The reception was held at Edgar's farmhouse outside Tupelo. Extended family filled the rooms. Cousins Roy barely recognized, a brother-in-law named Douglas, who'd had strong opinions about everything and never kept them to himself. Edgar's daughter Sandra, who managed the family's affairs and made clear, without ever saying it directly, that she had managed them correctly. Her husband Philip stood beside her, updating spreadsheets on his phone between handshakes. Nobody asked Roy how the drive had been. Nobody asked how his knee was holding up. He stood near the kitchen doorway, with a paper plate of food he wasn't eating, watching the room. Copper had stayed home, of course. Dogs didn't come to things like this. But Roy kept thinking about the old lab anyway. Copper had been restless the morning Roy left, pacing the kitchen floor in slow circles, watching the door. The lawyer arrived just after 2 in the afternoon. A careful, unhurried man named Mr. Whitfield, who set his briefcase on the dining room table and waited for the room to settle before he opened it. Edgar's estate was considerable. The farm itself, nearly 400 acres of good Mississippi bottomland. Investment accounts accumulated over 40 years of careful saving. 2 vehicles, both in excellent condition. Farm equipment. Timber rights. Sandra stood with her arms folded, already knowing most of it. Douglas leaned against the wall with a satisfied expression that Roy found difficult to look at. Mr. Whitfield worked through the documents methodically. The land and the farmhouse went to Sandra, as everyone expected. The accounts were divided between Edgar's 3 children and their families. The vehicles were allocated. The timber rights transferred. Then Mr. Whitfield turned a page. To Roy Hadley, Edgar's nephew, he read in his steady, practiced voice, "I leave the contents of the metal toolbox stored in the back workshop. The red one. He'll know which one." The room shifted. Sandra looked up slowly. Douglas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Roy looked at the lawyer. "Just the toolbox?" Mr. Whitfield checked the document. "Just the toolbox." He paused, along with a sealed envelope to be given directly to Roy at the time of reading. Sandra's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Douglas was less discreet. He let out a short breath and shook his head. Philip set his phone face down on the table. Roy accepted the envelope from the lawyer. He didn't open it in the room. He folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Afterward, Douglas caught him near the back door. He had the practiced casualness of a man who had learned to deliver condescension gently. "Don't take it personally," Douglas said. Edgar wasn't exactly sentimental about that side of the family. Roy looked at him for a moment. Then he walked outside without answering. The workshop stood behind the main barn. a low building with a tin roof and double doors that stuck when the humidity rose. Roy found the red toolbox immediately. It was larger than he remembered, a heavy-gauge steel chest on wheels, the kind mechanics used in professional garages. Painted red once, now faded to a dusty rose, with a few rust spots along the bottom rail. The kind of thing people walked past without noticing. He had to borrow a handcart to get it out to his truck. Nobody helped him. A few people watched from the porch without offering. He loaded it into the bed, drove away from the Hadley farm, and didn't look back. The drive home to Meridian took 4 hours and 11 minutes. Roy stopped once for gas, and a cup of coffee he drank standing next to the pump, watching the flat Mississippi landscape stretch out toward the tree line. The toolbox rode in the truck bed behind him, heavier than it looked. Copper heard the truck before Roy pulled all the way up the driveway. The old lab was already at the door when Roy pushed it open, tail swinging in wide, slow arcs. Roy knelt down and let the dog press against him. 12 years old and still here, he said. You're tougher than you look. Copper licked his hand. Roy had gotten Copper as a pup, the year he retired from the last job he'd held long enough to matter. The dog had been named by the neighbor's granddaughter who visited that summer, and declared he was exactly the color of a new penny. The name stuck. Copper had been with Roy through the worst years, the years Roy didn't talk about. The ones where the silence in the house got too heavy, and he'd sit on the back porch in the dark, listening to the frogs in the drainage ditch, because it was the only sound that didn't feel like a threat. Copper had always come out and sat beside him on those nights, never trying to fix anything. Just there. Roy brought the toolbox in from the truck and set it near the kitchen door. He gave Copper fresh water and a bowl of food, then sat down at the table with Edgar's envelope in front of him. He opened it slowly. The handwriting inside was Edgar's, slow and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write before everything became a keyboard. Roy, if you're reading this, then you were there at the reading, which means you made the drive, which means you're still stubborn enough to show up for family, even when family hasn't always shown up for you. Good. Roy stopped. He set the letter on the table and looked out the window for a moment. Outside, the yard was going dark. Fireflies were beginning to appear in the grass near the fence line. He picked the letter back up. I have a feeling Sandra and Douglas gave you some kind of look when Whitfield read out the toolbox. Don't mind them. They were never looking for what's actually valuable. They were always looking for what's easy to sell. The toolbox was my father's, your grandfather's. He built it himself, which is why the steel is heavier than what you'd buy in a store today. He kept it locked for as long as I knew him. The key is taped to the underside of the box, behind the left rear wheel. You'll need to get low to see it, Roy. I need you to look carefully at what's inside. Don't just open the lid and look at the top. Look at everything. Take your time. You were always better at that than most people. Pay attention. The letter ended there. No dramatic phrasing, no sentimental closing, just Edgar's signature, and below it, one more line. Give Copper a piece of ham for me. Roy sat at the table for a long time. The house was quiet around him. Copper had finished his food and settled onto the braided rug near the refrigerator, watching Roy with the patient expression he always had. Roy finally stood, walked to the toolbox, and got down on one knee to check the underside. The key was there, just as Edgar had written. Small, brass, taped in place with 2 strips of electrical tape that had dried and gone slightly stiff with age. Roy peeled it off carefully. He inserted the key into the top lock. The mechanism was smooth, well-maintained, the kind of mechanism that had been oiled and cared for, not neglected. The chest opened with a solid, certain sound. Inside, the top trays held what you'd expect. Good tools, old but clean, wrapped in cloth to keep them from rattling. Wrenches in graduated sizes. A level. 2 hand planes with wooden handles worn smooth. Roy lifted the top tray out and set it aside. The second tray held more of the same. And then below that, when he lifted the false bottom panel that ran the width of the chest, something different. Roy stopped. Copper lifted his head from the rug. The space beneath the false bottom was lined with a single piece of oilcloth, neatly folded at the edges. Resting on that cloth were stacks of documents, organized carefully, tied with faded ribbon. Roy reached in and lifted the first bundle. Land deeds. His grandfather's name was on them, property that Roy had never heard anyone mention. He set those aside and reached for the next bundle. More documents, more deeds. And then, beneath those, something that made him go completely still. A portfolio folder the kind lawyers used. Brown leather, initials pressed into the corner, and inside, share certificates. Dozens of them. Stocks issued before certificates had been replaced by digital records. Old companies, but Roy recognized names among them. Companies that had grown in the decades since his grandfather had purchased these shares. Companies that had split and grown and split again. Roy sat down on the floor. Copper got up slowly from the rug and walked over. The old dog settled beside him, pressing his warm weight against Roy's leg. Roy opened the last document in the folder. A notarized letter from Edgar, dated 2 years earlier, addressed to Roy by name. These shares and deed copies represent holdings our grandfather built over his lifetime and never disclosed, because he didn't trust the family to divide them without destroying each other. He told me about them when I was 30 and made me promise to keep the secret until I found the right person to leave them with. I've been holding that promise for 40 years. I believe that person is you. Not because you need money more than the others, though maybe that's also true, but because you're the only one who would know what to do with it that wouldn't make grandfather ashamed. Roy set the letter down on the kitchen floor. He looked at Copper. The dog looked back with the same dark, steady eyes he'd always had. Patient, calm, certain. Roy sat there for a long time without moving. Outside, the frogs had started up along the drainage ditch, the same sound that had kept him company on the bad nights. Steady and low and persistent. The next morning, Roy drove to a law office in Meridian and sat down with an attorney who did not seem like the kind of person who startled easily. It was good that she didn't, because what Roy laid on her desk required a careful expression. The attorney, a woman named Mrs. Alcott, who had been practicing for 31 years and had the composure to match, spent 2 hours going through the documents with methodical patience. She made phone calls. She requested records. She worked through her lunch. By 4 o'clock, she set her reading glasses on the desk and looked at Roy directly. "These holdings are real," she said. "The shares have been inactive, but the accounts are intact. With current valuations and the accumulated property assessments, you're looking at something in the range of $240 million, possibly more once we complete the full audit." Roy didn't say anything for a moment. 240 million. He had driven to Tupelo to collect a rusty toolbox, while Douglas smirked from a doorway. He had loaded it onto his truck alone. He had driven 4 hours with it rattling in the bed, not knowing what was inside. He asked Mrs. Alcott how long verification would take. "A few weeks," she said. "We'll need to be thorough. And Mr. Hadley," she added carefully. "This kind of discovery sometimes brings attention from people who feel they have a claim." Roy understood exactly what she meant. It took 6 days. On the 7th morning, a car Roy didn't recognize came up the gravel road. Sandra got out first. Douglas followed. They had driven 4 hours. Roy watched them from the porch. Copper stood beside him. Sandra came to the bottom of the porch steps. She was composed, as she always was, but something around her eyes wasn't quite steady. She had clearly been on the phone with her own lawyers. "Roy," she said, "we need to talk about what was in Edgar's toolbox." Roy didn't move. Copper stayed beside him. Sandra continued, "Whatever Edgar left you, it was part of the family estate. If he was holding assets that should have been disclosed during estate planning, then legally those assets—" "Roy." She stopped. Roy looked at her calmly. "Edgar wrote a letter," he said, "notarized, 2 years ago. His intentions were very clear, and a lawyer is already handling verification." Douglas stepped forward. "You're telling me you're going to sit on assets that belong to this whole family?" Copper let out a single low bark. Not aggressive. More like a period at the end of a sentence. Douglas stopped. Roy kept his voice even. Edgar left me what he chose to leave me. He had the legal right to do that, the same as you had the legal right to inherit 400 acres of good land. Sandra started to speak again. Roy shook his head. I'm not going to argue with you in my yard, he said. If you want to talk to my attorney, I'll give you her card. He went inside and came back with a business card. He handed it to Sandra. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at Roy, then looked at Copper. Something shifted in her expression. Not an apology, just a recognition of something she hadn't accounted for. They drove away 10 minutes later. Roy sat down in the porch chair. Copper settled at his feet. The gravel road was quiet again, dust hanging where the car had been. The letter from Edgar had said Roy would know what to do with it. Roy wasn't sure about that yet, but he was starting to have an idea. The lawsuit came 3 weeks later. Sandra and Douglas filed a claim through their attorneys, arguing that the assets in the toolbox had been intentionally concealed from the estate process and should be redistributed according to the original inheritance agreement. Roy drove to Jackson for the hearing. He brought Mrs. Alcott. He wore the same jacket he'd worn to the funeral. The courtroom was larger than Roy had expected and significantly quieter than the Hadley farm had been on the day of the reception. He sat at the plaintiff's table and listened as the opposing attorney laid out their argument. Edgar had hidden assets. The distribution was unfair. The letter could not be authenticated as a clear expression of testamentary intent. Mrs. Alcott waited until they were finished. Then she presented the notarized letter. She presented the timeline of Edgar's estate planning, which showed that the toolbox assets had been intentionally excluded from the general estate for reasons Edgar had documented in writing. She presented the chain of custody going back to Roy's grandfather, showing that these assets had never been part of Edgar's personal estate to begin with. They had always been held in trust, informally, and passed on with specific instruction. The judge read the letter carefully. Then she asked Sandra's attorney one question. Is there any document showing that Edgar Hadley was legally required to include these assets in his general estate? There was a silence. Then the answer came, No, Your Honor. The judge set the letter down. The ruling took 4 minutes to deliver. The assets belonged to Roy Hadley, in accordance with documented intent and clear chain of ownership. The case was dismissed. Roy walked out of the courthouse into Jackson morning sunshine. Mrs. Alcott walked beside him. She didn't say much, which Roy appreciated. Some things didn't need words. He drove back to Meridian. Copper was at the door. Roy sat down on the kitchen floor, same as he had the night he'd opened the toolbox and let the old dog press against him. He could feel Copper's breathing, slow and steady, the familiar weight of him. Good boy, he said. He sat there for a while before getting up. The months that followed were strange and quiet. The money moved through legal processes with the measured pace of things that are real rather than imagined. Mrs. Alcott handled most of it, checking in by phone, sending paperwork that Roy signed at the kitchen table. Neighbors noticed the new roof, then the new truck. They didn't ask about it directly. Meridian was a town where people understood that some questions weren't theirs to ask. But Roy was working on something else. He had driven down to the VA clinic in Meridian a few times over the years, not for himself, or not only for himself. He knew some of the men there. Vietnam veterans, most of them, a few from the Gulf. Men who sat in waiting rooms that needed better chairs and better lighting, and 100 other things that nobody had budgeted for. Roy started making calls. Then he made an appointment. Then he sat across from the director of the Mississippi Veterans Assistance Network and laid out what he was thinking. Not a clinic, not a program, a house. An actual house with a yard and a kitchen and room enough for a few men at a time who needed somewhere to land for a while. A place where they weren't patients, where they were just men sitting in a kitchen, eating food that someone had cooked, with a dog at their feet if they wanted that. The director was quiet for a moment after Roy finished. Then she said, in a careful voice that meant she was taking him seriously, "How much are you thinking to put toward this?" Roy told her. She was quiet again. Then she nodded slowly. Roy broke ground on the property 6 months later, on a piece of land he bought just outside Meridian, set back from the road with good trees around it. He hired local contractors. He was specific about the kitchen. He wanted it to feel like a real house, because it was going to be a real house. By spring, the first veterans moved in. Roy visited 3 times a week. He brought Copper when the old dog was feeling up to it, which was less often now. Copper was 13, moving slower, sleeping more, but on the days Roy brought him, the lab would make his slow rounds through the rooms, stopping beside whichever man seemed the quietest, and simply stay there. Roy had seen that behavior his whole life. He understood it. One afternoon in early April, Roy sat on the back porch of the new house with a man named Franklin, who had come back from Iraq 11 years ago and hadn't quite managed to sleep a full night since. Copper was between them. The yard stretched out toward a line of pine trees. Somewhere in the distance, birds were working the edge of the field. Franklin scratched Copper behind the ears. The dog's tail thumped slowly. "How long you had him?" Franklin asked. "Going on 13 years, Roy said. Franklin nodded. He was quiet for a while. "My dog died the year I deployed," he said finally. "Never got another one. Didn't feel right somehow." Roy didn't fill the silence. He'd learned long ago that some silences were the point. After a while, Franklin said, "This is a good place." Roy looked out at the yard, at the pine trees, at the afternoon light coming through them in long slanted lines. "Yeah," he said, "it is." He drove home that evening with Copper riding slow and easy in the passenger seat, the way he always had. The gravel road was dry and pale in the last light. The house looked the same as it always had. Small, familiar. Nothing from the outside that would tell you anything about what had happened in the kitchen that winter night. Roy parked and sat in the truck for a moment. He thought about the red toolbox, about Edgar, about his grandfather's name on deeds that nobody in the family had known to look for, about Douglas's face in the doorway of the Hadley farmhouse, so certain he already knew what mattered. He thought about Copper sitting beside him on the kitchen floor the night he found the documents, pressing his warm weight against Roy's leg without being asked. Roy had always been the quiet one, the one who came home from Vietnam and never quite fit back into the shape the family had held for him, the one they didn't know how to talk to at Christmas, the one Edgar had called every few weeks for no particular reason, just to talk about the weather. Nobody had expected anything from Roy Hadley. That was, it turned out, exactly the point. He got out of the truck. Copper stepped down slowly from the passenger side and walked toward the door, tail moving in the same easy arc it always had. The red toolbox still sat in the corner of the kitchen. Roy had kept it there. He wasn't sure why, exactly. It was heavy and took up space he didn't have a lot of. But every time he thought about moving it, he didn't. He ran his hand across the faded red steel as he walked past it. Some things looked like junk from a distance. You had to get close. You had to pay attention. You had to have a dog patient enough to stay beside you until you figured out what you were looking at. Roy went to the refrigerator and took out the ham he'd bought at the grocery store. 2 days ago, the good kind, thick-sliced. He tore off a piece and held it down. Copper took it gently. Roy crouched beside him and scratched behind his ears for a long moment. Edgar had asked him to do that, and Roy figured some promises were worth keeping, even small ones. Especially the small ones.